At Thanksgiving, my mom snapped, "You're just a burden. Always have been." My brother laughed and said, "At least I make this family proud." I put down my fork, stood up, and left without a word. Weeks later, Dad called, "Why is the mortgage unpaid?" I just said, "Ask your pride and joy." Before I tell you exactly how I turned the tables and took everything from the people who tried to ruin me, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments section below. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and listen to the whole story. The dining room felt impossibly thick, suffocating, heavily scented with roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the aggressively expensive cologne my older brother Julian always insisted on wearing. For years, I had been the one making sure this dinner even happened. I paid for the groceries out of my own salary. I arrived 3 hours early to help prep the meals while my mother complained about her back. I set the table, polished the silverware, and sat quietly at the very end of the table while my family treated me like a ghost who occasionally paid their bills. But that specific Thanksgiving, something fundamentally broke inside of me. We were passing the mashed potatoes. Julian was holding court, bragging about some new startup venture, dominating the conversation as usual. His new girlfriend, Danielle, sat next to him, nodding along like he was giving a TED Talk. I had just made a small, self-deprecating joke about the mortgage, a subtle passing reminder that I was the one keeping a roof over their heads while Julian drove a luxury car. I didn't mean it maliciously, just a quick comment. My mother, Margaret, stopped eating. She slowly lowered her fork, the metal clinking sharply against her expensive porcelain plate. She looked right through me, her eyes hardening into tiny dark stones. "You know, Wyatt," she snapped, her voice cutting straight through the festive jazz music playing softly from the corner speaker. "You have always acted like you are doing us some huge favor. You sit there with that quiet, judgmental look on your face. You are not doing us a favor. You are just a burden. You always have been." The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the ice melting in the water glasses. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline hit my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. I looked over at my father, Robert. He just stared down at his plate, meticulously cutting a piece of dry turkey, entirely unwilling to defend the son who had been paying his crippling debts for half a decade. Then, the sound that finally killed my loyalty echoed from across the table. Julian chuckled. It was a rich, arrogant, dismissive sound. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, swirling his red wine, and looked at me with absolute contempt. "At least I make this family proud, little brother," he said, taking a sip. Danielle giggled nervously beside him, covering her mouth. I did not yell. I did not throw my plate against the wall, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. I simply put my fork down. The metal clicked against the ceramic. I stood up, pushed my chair in perfectly straight so it aligned with the table, turned my back on them, and walked out the front door. I grabbed my coat, got into my car, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror once. I stopped paying for everything that very night. I logged into my bank app in the driveway and deleted every single autodraft. 3 weeks later, the phone buzzed on my kitchen counter. It was my dad. I answered it, letting the heavy silence hang between us. "Wyatt," he barked, sounding more annoyed than concerned. "Why is the mortgage unpaid? I just got a delinquency notice from the bank in the mail. What is wrong with you?" I leaned against my counter, staring out the window at the empty street. I felt nothing but a clean, sharp clarity. The fear of their disapproval was gone. "Ask your pride and joy," I said, and hung up. That was the moment the war started. But to understand why I finally pulled the plug, you need to know how deep the rot actually went. Growing up in the Miller house meant knowing your exact place in the hierarchy, and my place was firmly cemented in the background. Julian was 2 years older and possessed a natural, loud charisma that sucked all the oxygen out of any room he walked into. He was the star high school quarterback, the honor roll student, the golden boy who could do absolutely no wrong. My parents literally built a shrine to him in the living room, huge glass display cases filled with his football trophies, framed newspaper clippings highlighting his game-winning throws, and academic medals. I had a single, slightly wrinkled spelling bee certificate magnet to the side of the refrigerator where nobody could see it unless they were reaching for the trash can. The favoritism was not just emotional. It was entirely financial. I remember the exact moment I realized my future didn't matter to them. When Julian turned 16, they completely drained what was supposed to be our joint college fund. Every penny my grandparents had left us. They used it to buy Julian a reliable, slightly used sedan so he could drive to his football practices in comfort. They said he needed to focus on his athletic future. 2 years later, when I turned 16, my dad handed me a laminated bus pass and told me that getting a part-time job flipping burgers builds character. I believed their logic for a long time. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at him. Julian went off to a prestigious private university on a partial athletic scholarship, while my parents gladly took out massive high-interest loans to cover his remaining tuition and his fraternity dues. I stayed behind. I went to a local community college, working brutal night shifts loading boxes at a logistics warehouse just to pay my own tuition and buy my own textbooks. But the starkest, most painful contrast always came during the holidays. Let me paint a picture of last Christmas for you. I was in the kitchen, wearing a stained apron, basting a turkey I had paid for with my own salary. Suddenly, the entire house shook. Julian pulled up to the driveway in a jet-black Porsche 911. The exhaust rumbled so loud it rattled the living room windows. My mother dropped the tray of appetizers she was holding and practically sprinted out the front door, screaming with absolute joy. She hugged him like a conquering hero returning from a victorious war. Julian strutted up the driveway wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my monthly rent, tossing the Porsche keys to my dad to go park it for him. My dad, a man who rarely smiled, beamed with pride and practically ran to move the car. Julian spent the entire evening dominating the room. He bragged about his new consulting firm, tossing out corporate buzzwords and talking loudly about his massive stock portfolios and his upcoming ski trip to Aspen. He walked around our parents' house like he owned it, acting like it was his rightful inheritance anyway, pointing out how he would remodel the kitchen someday when it was his. No one asked how my job as a project analyst was going. No one asked if I was happy or tired, or if I had anyone special in my life. I was just the guy who refilled the ice bucket when Julian's drink got warm. I was the guy who took out the trash bags full of wrapping paper from the expensive gifts they bought each other. I was the reliable, invisible workhorse, and they took absolute advantage of that quiet loyalty. The real trap closed around my neck exactly 5 years ago. It started with a frantic phone call in the middle of a Tuesday night. My mother was screaming on the other end. My father had suffered a severe heart attack. I rushed to the hospital, running red lights, terrified I was going to lose him. He survived, but the aftermath was a financial disaster. The medical bills were catastrophic. His recovery meant he had to step down from his demanding management job and take a massive pay cut on disability. Suddenly, the flawless Miller family image was in serious jeopardy. The bank started sending bold, red-lettered foreclosure warnings. The credit card companies called the house phone 5 times a day. I remember sitting in their dimly lit living room, looking at the towering stack of final notices scattered across the coffee table. My mother was weeping into a tissue, looking frantically at Julian. Julian, wearing a luxury watch that could have paid off 3 months of their mortgage, sighed loudly and rubbed his temples like he was the one carrying the burden. I wish I could step in, Mom. I really do, Julian said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. But my salary is completely tied up in aggressive investments right now. I need liquid capital to keep my consulting business afloat and expand my team. I just can't take on a mortgage commitment. It would ruin my momentum. Then they both looked at me. It was the first time in my entire life I felt like they truly needed me. They weren't looking past me. They were looking right at me. I can help, I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Just until Dad gets back on his feet and through rehab. I have some savings from my warehouse days, and my new job pays well enough if I budget tightly. My mother practically lunged across the table. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it so tight her nails dug into my skin. She called me a blessing. She cried tears of relief. So I took over. I sat down with my laptop and set up an autopay from my checking account directly to their mortgage lender. I took over the electricity bill. I paid the water. I even started covering the quarterly property taxes. Month after month, year after year, a massive chunk of my hard-earned paycheck disappeared to keep a roof over the heads of people who barely acknowledged my existence outside of the first of the month. Just a little longer, Wyatt, my mother would say during the first year, patting my shoulder. By the third year, they completely stopped thanking me. By the fifth year, it wasn't a favor anymore. It was an expectation. I became a walking utility company. If a pipe burst in the basement, my dad didn't call a plumber, he called me to pay for the plumber. If the property tax went up, my mother told me I needed to adjust my budget to cover the difference. Julian never offered a single dime. Not once. He continued taking extravagant vacations to Europe, upgrading his cars every 2 years, and buying designer clothes, completely secure in the knowledge that his little brother was holding the family foundation together. I was literally funding his illusion of wealth by keeping our parents off his back. And I did it because I foolishly, stupidly believed that family takes care of family, and that one day they would love me for it. After that explosive Thanksgiving dinner, everything shifted into a cold, hard reality. I drove back to my apartment, walked straight to my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and logged directly into my banking portal. My fingers were completely steady. I didn't hesitate. I found the recurring payments tab. Mortgage, canceled. Utilities, canceled. Homeowner's insurance, canceled. With 3 simple clicks of a mouse, I cut the financial umbilical cord. I did not send a warning text. I did not write an angry, emotional email explaining myself. I just let the silence do the talking. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to realize the ATM had permanently shut down. Weeks passed in total silence. The Christmas season rolled in, covering the city in snow and holiday lights. For the past 3 years, I had hosted Christmas dinner at my place. Why? Because I had the space, and I was the one paying for the expensive prime rib anyway. I waited for a phone call, a text, anything asking what time they should come over, or even a fake apology to smooth things over. The call never came. Instead, on Christmas Eve, I was sitting alone on my couch, eating lukewarm Chinese takeout, when I opened Facebook on my phone. There it was, the first post on my feed. A massive, smiling group photo. Julian, my mom, my dad, and Danielle, standing in front of a massive, perfectly decorated pine tree, holding tall glasses of expensive champagne. They had rented a luxury cabin in the mountains. The caption my mother wrote felt like a physical punch to the gut. It read, "So blessed to spend the holidays with the people who matter most. Some people choose to abandon family when things get slightly difficult, but real family always sticks together. #blessed, #Julian is the best." I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. They did not miss me. They did not care that I was sitting alone in a dark apartment on Christmas Eve. They just patched over my absence, used Julian's credit cards to rent a cabin, and kept the party going without missing a beat. Then, right as I was about to turn my phone off, it rang. It was Aunt Clara, my mother's sister. Clara was a notorious busybody, a woman who thrived on family drama and gossip. I answered cautiously, expecting a trap. "Wyatt, honey," she said, her voice dripping with thick, fake sympathy. "I just wanted to call and check on you. Making sure you are doing okay. Considering everything." "I'm fine, Clara. Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. She paused, a deliberate, theatrical hesitation designed to build suspense. "Well, with your situation. We are all just praying for you, sweetie." I frowned, setting my takeout box down. "What situation?" Aunt Clara lowered her voice to a dramatic whisper, as if she were sharing classified state secrets. "Wyatt, your mother told everyone at the extended family dinner last week. She told us you are having a severe mental breakdown, that you are deeply depressed, lashing out at everyone, and Well, she implied you might be struggling with some heavy substance abuse issues. My blood ran completely cold. I stood up, gripping the edge of my kitchen counter so hard my knuckles turned a stark white. She said what? She said you just walked out of Thanksgiving completely unprovoked. Clara continued, clearly enjoying delivering the gossip. She said you were screaming about how you hate the family, acting totally erratic. She told everyone you cut off contact because you are too unstable to be around normal people right now. We are all very worried, Wyatt. She said Julian even tried to get you into a rehab facility, but you refused. I closed my eyes. The sheer, calculated evil of it actually took my breath away. Margaret was not just covering up the fact that I had stopped paying their bills. She knew the foreclosure notices were coming. She was actively destroying my reputation to ensure that when they lost the house, nobody in our extended family would blame her, and nobody would blame Julian. They would blame the crazy, unstable, drug-addicted son who abandoned his poor, struggling parents. She was preemptively assassinating my character to protect Julian's golden image and her own victim narrative. Clara, I said, my voice dead calm, stripping away any emotion. I am perfectly fine. I have not touched a drug in my life. I simply stopped paying their mortgage after 5 years of funding their lifestyle. That is the truth. Believe what you want. I hung up the phone before she could respond. The final, fraying thread holding my conscience together snapped cleanly in two. Any lingering guilt I had about leaving them high and dry evaporated instantly into the cold air. They wanted to paint me as a villain? Fine. But I was not going to be the pathetic, unstable villain they invented to save face. I was going to be the cold, calculating consequence they never saw coming. I was done bleeding for people who used my blood to paint themselves as victims. January hit with brutal, unforgiving force, and the grand illusion my family had carefully constructed over decades finally began to shatter. It started with Marcus, an old buddy of mine from high school who had always foolishly looked up to Julian. Marcus called me late on a Tuesday night. When I answered, he sounded like he had been crying for hours, his voice thick and panicky. Wyatt, man, I need to know where your brother is right now. He is not answering my calls. He blocked my number. I don't talk to him, Marcus. I haven't spoken to him since Thanksgiving. What happened? I asked, pacing my living room. Marcus broke down into heavy sobs. He ruined me, Wyatt. Julian came to me 3 months ago pitching a massive commercial real estate venture. He promised guaranteed returns. He showed me detailed spreadsheets, corporate escrow accounts, blueprints. It looked so professional. I gave him 50 grand, Wyatt. It was everything I had saved. It was my kids' college fund. I stopped pacing. Marcus, what did he do? Now I find out his consulting firm fired him for embezzling client funds. The whole new business venture was a complete shell game to pay off his personal debts. Danielle packed her bags and left him yesterday when the repo guys came for the Porsche. My wife found out about the money today, Wyatt. I'm looking at a brutal divorce and a nasty custody battle for my kids because of your brother. He is completely broke, he's facing lawsuits, and he took me down with him. I listened in stunned silence. Julian the genius. Julian the millionaire. He was nothing but a fraud wearing a nice suit. His entire life was built on stolen money, credit card debt, and lies. He had been fired. He was bankrupt. And now the golden boy had nowhere left to hide. The consequences were finally catching up to him, and by extension, catching up to my parents who relied entirely on the false prestige he provided to mask their own failures. I felt a brief, dark flash of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, heavy dread. I knew exactly how these people operated. A drowning man will drag down anyone close enough to grab, and I was the only life raft left with a steady salary. I knew they would come for me. The silence wouldn't last. They did not wait long. 2 days after Marcus called me weeping about his impending divorce, my phone started lighting up. First, a text from my mother. It was sickeningly sweet, completely ignoring the fact that she had just told the entire extended family I was a drug addict. Hi, honey. I know tensions were high at the holidays, but family is family. We forgive you for walking out. We miss you terribly. Let's grab dinner this week. I'll make your favorite roast. Love you so much. I stared at the glowing screen, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. We forgive you. The absolute audacity was staggering. They were facing financial ruin, and her strategy was to offer me a roast dinner in exchange for a bailout. I deleted the text. For hours later, my dad texted. He lacked his wife's subtlety and cut straight to the chase, confirming my suspicions. Wyatt, your mother is very stressed and her blood pressure is up. The bank sent another notice today. We are 3 months behind. Julian hit a rough patch at work and needs time to restructure. We need you to cover the arrears, just this once. Be a man and help your family out. I deleted that message too. I owed them absolutely nothing. But the crowning jewel of their desperation came at 11 p.m. that night. A voicemail from Julian. I played it on speakerphone, recording it on my laptop just in case I needed it. His voice sounded strained, slightly breathless, but he was still trying desperately to maintain that arrogant, corporate alpha male tone. Hey Wyatt, look man, I know things got a little heated at Thanksgiving. Water under the bridge, right? Listen, I'm transitioning between ventures right now, taking a step back from the corporate grind to launch my own firm. I have a massive opportunity, but I need some liquid startup capital to secure the licensing. Since you live alone, have a good salary, and don't really have any major expenses, I figured you could front me a loan. Think of it as an investment. You give me 50 grand, I'll pay you back with 20% interest in 6 months. It's a win-win. Call me. I sat at my kitchen table, utterly disgusted. He wasn't apologizing. He was pitching me. He had just ruined Marcus's life, likely heading for a divorce court over stolen funds. And now he was trying to extract $50,000 from the brother he called a burden. He genuinely believed I existed solely to serve him. I didn't return the call. I turned my phone off and went to sleep, thinking the worst of it was over. I was horribly wrong. It was a completely normal Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk at the office, running complex data projections for a logistics meeting, when an unknown number popped up on my cell phone. Normally, I let those go straight to voicemail, but a strange instinct made me pick it up. Hello? I said, keeping my eyes on my spreadsheet. Hi, is this Mr. Wyatt Miller? A professional male voice asked. Speaking. How can I help you? Mr. Miller, this is Kevin Brooks calling from Lakeshore Lending. We are reaching out regarding the final processing of your new mortgage application for the property at 4131 Willow Bend Lane. We just need to verify a few minor details regarding your primary income source before we finalize the loan dispersal tomorrow morning. The air in my lungs vanished. The bustling sounds of the office around me faded into a distant, muffled hum. The room started to spin. 4131 Willow Bend Lane was my parents' address. I'm sorry, I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly as I gripped the edge of my desk. What mortgage application? I haven't applied for any loans. I haven't spoken to a lender in years. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Kevin typing rapidly on a keyboard. Sir, I have a fully signed application here dated 4 days ago. It lists you as the primary borrower with Julian Miller as the cosigner. The intended use of funds is listed as family business capital. The collateral is the existing equity in the home. We received your W-2s, your bank statements, and your authorized signature on the digital documents. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, threatening to crack them. Kevin? I said, forcing the rising panic down and speaking with absolute, terrifying precision. Listen to me very carefully. I did not sign those documents. I did not provide those bank statements. I have not spoken to Julian Miller in months. That application is entirely fraudulent. Kevin's professional tone shifted instantly to serious, legal concern. Mr. Miller, are you stating on a recorded line that this is an active case of identity theft? Yes, I breathed out, the reality of the betrayal crushing my chest. Do not fund that loan. Freeze the application immediately. I will involve law enforcement. I hung up the phone and pushed my chair back from my desk. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. Julian hadn't just asked for money. When I ignored his voicemail, he decided to steal it. He had somehow gotten his hands on my personal financial records, probably digging through old tax documents I had left at our parents' house years ago. He forged my signature, used my good credit score, and attempted to leverage our parents' house to bail himself out of the massive debt he had accumulated. He was willing to destroy my financial future, chain me to hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, without a second thought. 10 minutes later, Kevin Brooks emailed me the flagged PDF documents. I opened the file with shaking hands, the bright screen burning my eyes. There it was. My name, my social security number, my private checking account details, and at the bottom of the last page, a remarkably good forgery of my signature. I told my manager I was sick and left work early. I drove back to my apartment in a complete daze, the city traffic blurring around me like I was moving underwater. I walked through my front door, dropped my keys heavily on the counter, and walked slowly into the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator, staring blankly at the empty glass shelves and a half-empty carton of milk. My legs gave out. I sank to the cold linoleum floor, my back against the cabinets, and pulled my knees to my chest. I sat there for 3 hours as the sun went down, plunging the apartment into complete darkness. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep, too fundamental for tears. It was a visceral, physical ache in the center of my chest, like a knife twisting slowly. This was my family, the people who were supposed to protect me from the world. I had given them 5 years of my salary. I had sacrificed my own savings, delayed my own life goals, and swallowed their daily insults just to keep them safe and warm. And in return, my mother called me a crazy drug addict to save her own social standing, and my brother tried to commit a federal felony to steal my identity and put me into massive debt. And my father? He just watched it all happen in silence. It was the absolute bottom, the lowest I had ever felt in my 31 years of life. Every ounce of loyalty, every shred of naive hope that I could one day earn their love, died right there on that kitchen floor. They were not my family. They were parasites, and they had finally pushed me past the point of no return. As the streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows across my living room, the crushing weight of betrayal slowly transformed. The sadness burned away, leaving behind a cold, hardened, absolute rage. I wasn't just going to cut them off anymore. I was going to make sure they could never, ever hurt me again. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I packed a single duffel bag with warm clothes, threw it into the trunk of my car, and drove 3 hours north to a remote cabin by a lake. The cabin had belonged to my grandfather. Ever since his funeral 5 years ago, it had sat mostly empty, left to me and his will simply because I was the only grandchild who ever drove up to help him fix the leaky roof. There was no cell service up here, no internet, just the sound of the wind tearing through the ancient pine trees and the dark water lapping against the dock. I needed total isolation. I needed to separate myself from the noise, the panic, and the hurt to figure out exactly how to dismantle the trap my family had built around me. I spent the first day chopping wood, swinging the heavy axe until my shoulders burned and my hands blistered, exhausting myself physically so I wouldn't have to think. I spent the second day sitting on the wooden dock, staring out at the freezing water, tracing every timeline, every bank transaction, every lie they had told me over the last decade. By the morning of the third day, my mind was sharper than a surgical scalpel. I drove 10 miles into the nearest small town, found a dingy diner with a decent Wi-Fi connection, ordered a black coffee, and opened my laptop. I didn't search for therapists or support groups. I searched for legal destruction. I drafted an email to Marissa, a ruthless, brilliant corporate lawyer I had met during a tense contract negotiation at my firm last year. She was notoriously aggressive, expensive, and incredibly efficient. Marissa, I typed, my fingers flying across the keys. I am dealing with an active case of family fraud and identity theft. I have the forged documents directly from a mortgage lender. My brother attempted to take out a fraudulent loan using my credentials. I need to protect my assets, press criminal charges, and ensure he can never come near my finances again. Are you available to take this on? Her reply came back within 15 minutes. I am available. We will lock down your credit, file a formal police report, and draft a cease and desist today. But before we begin, I need to ask you a serious question. Wyatt, considering this is your immediate family, how loud do you want to be? I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. How loud did I want to be? I had spent my entire life being quiet. I had suffered in silence, paid in silence, and walked away in silence. Look exactly where it got me. I typed my response, hitting the keys so hard they echoed in the quiet diner. Deafening. First thing Monday morning, I was sitting across from Marissa in her sleek, high-rise office downtown. She didn't offer me tea or sympathy. She offered strategy, and we moved with brutal efficiency. Within 48 hours, an impenetrable iron fortress was erected around my life. First, we placed hard fraud alerts and credit freezes on all 3 major credit bureaus. No one could open so much as a store credit card in my name. Second, we marched into the local precinct and filed a formal police report for identity theft and wire fraud against Julian Miller. We handed the detective the digital trail, the forged PDF documents, and the recorded phone call from Kevin Brooks at the bank. It was now an active criminal investigation. Then, Marissa drafted a cease and desist order that read like a legal declaration of war. It formally banned Julian, Margaret, and Robert Miller from contacting me, accessing any of my accounts, or using my name in any financial or legal capacity, under threat of immediate civil litigation and further criminal charges. A process server handed the thick envelope to Julian outside his cheap, newly rented apartment the very next day. An hour after the papers were served, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. Marissa had advised me not to answer, but I needed to hear the panic in his voice. I picked up. Are you insane? Julian screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. A police report, Wyatt? A cease and desist? You are trying to put me in jail over a simple misunderstanding. Forgery is not a misunderstanding, Julian, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any brotherly affection. It is a felony. You committed a crime. I was going to pay the loan myself. I just needed your credit score to secure the interest rate. You are my brother, you selfish prick. I am drowning here. The business went under. Danielle left me, and you are sending cops to my door? You stole my identity because you are a failure, I replied calmly, feeling a surge of power I had never known. You lost your job. You lost Marcus's money. And now you are going to lose your freedom. You have no one to blame but yourself. Do not ever call this number again. I ended the call and blocked the number. The shield was up. They couldn't touch my money, and they couldn't touch my credit. But defending myself wasn't enough anymore. I needed to completely remove myself from their blast radius. I needed a fresh start. I walked into my office on Wednesday morning with a completely different posture. For years, I had kept my head down, doing excellent work but letting louder colleagues take the credit because I was afraid of the spotlight. Not anymore. I had survived the absolute worst my own blood could do to me. Pitching a project in a corporate boardroom was nothing. My coworker and close friend, Elijah, noticed the change immediately. You look like you just woke up from a 10-year coma, man, he joked over coffee in the break room. I did, I told him, looking him dead in the eye. And I'm done sitting on the bench. That afternoon, I bypassed my direct manager and requested a direct meeting with Mr. Sterling, the regional CEO. He was a stern, brilliant man who valued hard results over office politics. I didn't ask for permission. I walked into his spacious office, connected my laptop to his projector, and pitched a massive logistical restructuring plan I had been quietly developing on my own time for 6 months. It identified over $1 million in wasted resources across our supply chain. I delivered the presentation with absolute, unshakable confidence, anticipating every question he threw at me. Sterling sat back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at the data on the screen, then looked intensely at me. Why have you been sitting on this, Wyatt? This is high-level thinking. I was waiting for the right moment to leverage it. I lied smoothly. I want to implement this, but I want to do it from the Portland office. He raised a gray eyebrow. Portland was our fastest growing, most competitive hub. You want a transfer? I want a promotion, I corrected him without blinking. Make me the senior lead of operations in Portland, and I will execute this plan and save you $1 million by Q4. Sterling smiled. It was a predator's smile, recognizing another of his kind. Done. Human Resources will send over your new salary package by tomorrow morning. Comes with a generous relocation fund. Pack your bags, Wyatt. I walked out of that office vibrating with adrenaline. The massive salary increase was life-changing, but the distance was the real prize. Portland was 700 miles away. I listed my house on the market that weekend. It sold in 3 days to an all-cash buyer. I packed up my life, hired a moving truck, and drove out of my hometown, watching the city limits fade in the rearview mirror. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Aunt Clara. I just vanished into thin air, leaving them to deal with the absolute wreckage Julian had created. I thought I was closing the book on the Miller family forever. But fate, as it turns out, had a much darker sense of humor, and the ultimate payback was just waiting in my spam folder. Life in Portland was everything my old life was not. It was quiet, incredibly fast-paced at work, and completely free of the suffocating expectations I had carried for 31 years. My promotion came with a heavy workload, but for the first time, my salary reflected the actual hours I put into the company. I rented a modern apartment overlooking the river. I bought myself a decent coffee machine. I started sleeping through the entire night without waking up in a cold sweat about someone else's unpaid bills. My side logistics business was also picking up traction, bringing in independent client contracts that padded my savings account faster than I ever thought possible. For 6 straight months, the Miller family was nothing but a bad memory fading in my rearview mirror. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, trying to find a missing invoice from a vendor. I clicked over to my spam folder. I scrolled past the usual junk mail, the fake lottery winnings, and the clothing store promotions. Right near the bottom of the first page, a subject line caught my eye. It made the coffee in my mouth taste suddenly bitter. Urgent. Pre-foreclosure notice, 4131, Willow Bend Lane. I froze. I almost deleted it, assuming it was a phishing scam. But the sender address was legitimate. It was from the automated system at the regional bank that held my parents' mortgage. I clicked the email open. The message was entirely automated. A cold digital warning stating that the property was officially 4 months delinquent. Because my email address was still buried in their archaic payment portal from the 5 years I spent paying their bills, the system had automatically copied me on the final delinquency warning. I read the numbers on the screen. The past due balance was massive. The late fees had compounded. The property was scheduled to be transferred to the county for public auction in less than 60 days. I sat back in my chair and stared at the gray Portland sky outside my window. Julian had failed them. His fake consulting firm, his stolen money, his arrogance. None of it was enough to save the family home. The golden boy had let the castle crumble. I thought about my mother, who had so confidently called me a burden. I thought about my father, who had demanded I act like a man and bail them out. They were about to lose everything. The house they always told Julian he would inherit was slipping right through their fingers. At first, I felt a twinge of pity. It is hard to completely erase 3 decades of conditioning. But then I remembered the forged loan documents. I remembered Julian trying to steal my identity and chain me to federal fraud. I remembered the vicious lies my mother told Aunt Clara about me being an unstable drug addict. The pity vanished, replaced by a cold, brilliant, and entirely ruthless idea. They were going to lose the house at auction. Some random real estate flipper was going to buy it for pennies on the dollar, kick them out, slap some cheap gray paint on the walls, and sell it for a massive profit. But what if a random flipper didn't buy it? What if I bought it? I did not waste a single second. I picked up my phone and called Marissa, my lawyer. She answered on the second ring. Wyatt, please tell me your brother did not violate the restraining order. she said sharply. No, I replied, a slow smile creeping across my face. Julian is being a very good boy. But I have a new project for you, Marissa. I need you to set up a blind limited liability company. I want the ownership completely obscured through a registered agent. No public records tying it back to my name. Then, I need you to contact a real estate broker in my hometown. I explained the pre-foreclosure notice. I laid out exactly what I wanted to do. I heard Marissa let out a low whistle on the other end of the line. You want to buy your parents' foreclosed house at the county auction right out from under them, she summarized. That is incredibly cold, Wyatt. I love it. But we need to make sure this is bulletproof. If they find out it is you, they could try to tie you up in civil court, claiming you manipulated the foreclosure or that you owe them the equity. They cannot claim anything, I told her, walking over to my filing cabinet. I pulled out a thick blue folder I had kept hidden for years. 5 years ago, when I first started paying their mortgage, I made them sign a notarized document acknowledging my financial contributions. It states clearly that I paid over $90,000 in mortgage arrears and property taxes. It proves I did not steal their equity. I subsidized it. And Julian's recent criminal attempt to forge my signature on a new loan destroys any credibility they have. Send me a scan of that document right now, Marissa said, her voice filled with professional excitement. I will get the LLC paperwork filed by tomorrow morning. The trap was officially set. A week later, my phone buzzed. It was Aunt Clara. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Hello, Clara. Oh, Wyatt, she sighed, laying the drama on incredibly thick. I know we haven't spoken since the holidays, but I am just sick with worry. Things are so bad back home. Julian's business had a terrible setback. He had to move into your parents' basement. He is completely bankrupt. And your poor mother, she is just a wreck. The bank is being so unreasonable. That sounds difficult, I said, offering absolutely zero emotion. It is a tragedy, Clara continued, clearly fishing for me to open my wallet. Your mother was crying at church on Sunday. She told the pastor they are just praying for a miracle investor to step in and save the house. Somebody to buy the debt and let them stay. I looked out my window at the beautiful Portland skyline. A miracle investor. That is exactly what they thought they deserved. They spent their whole lives treating me like dirt, and now they were waiting for God to send someone to clean up their mess. Tell them to keep praying, Clara, I said, and hung up. I was going to be their investor. But I was definitely not going to let them stay. The county courthouse in my hometown smelled exactly like I remembered. A suffocating mix of cheap floor wax, old paper, and stale coffee. The auction was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a dreary Thursday. I had taken 2 days of PTO and flown back on a red-eye flight the night before. I did not tell a single soul I was in the state. I walked into the back of the small auction room wearing a thick black peacoat, a dark baseball cap pulled low over my eyes, and a pair of dark sunglasses resting on the collar of my shirt. I sat in the very last row, making myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The room was mostly filled with local real estate investors, contractors, and bankers. Sitting 3 rows ahead of me was Eleanor's local contact, a sharp, aggressive real estate agent named David, whom Marissa had hired to act as the public face of my anonymous LLC. David did not even know my real identity. He just knew he had a massive cashier's check and strict orders not to lose. The bank-appointed auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium. He looked exhausted, shuffling through a thick stack of manila folders. He droned on, reading the legal disclaimers in a monotone voice. Finally, he pulled the folder I had been waiting for. Next property up for public bid, the auctioneer announced, tapping his microphone. 4131 Willow Bend Lane. Single-family home, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. The bank is looking to recover the outstanding balance and penalties. Opening bid is set at $242,000. Do I hear 242? A woman in the front row, probably a house flipper, raised her numbered paddle. 242. David immediately raised his paddle. 245. 250. The woman countered, turning slightly to look at David. 255. David shot back without a second of hesitation. The room grew quiet. 255,000 was pushing the upper limit of what flippers wanted to pay for a house that likely needed extensive repairs. The woman in the front row frowned, did some quick math on her phone calculator, and shook her head. She lowered her paddle. I have 255,000, the auctioneer called out, looking around the room. Do I hear 260? 260 going once. Silence. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought the guy sitting next to me could hear it. Going twice. No one moved. Sold. For $255,000 to the gentleman in the third row. The auctioneer slammed his wooden gavel down. The sharp crack echoed off the linoleum floors. I closed my eyes behind my cap and let out a long, trembling breath. It was done. The house where I had spent my entire childhood feeling invisible. The house where I had scrubbed floors, paid bills, and swallowed insults. The house they promised to Julian because he was the family pride and joy. It now belonged entirely to me, and they did not have a single clue. I stayed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town for 3 agonizing days while Marissa and David finalized the deed transfer and the mountain of legal paperwork. I wanted everything locked in stone before I made my final move. Once the county clerk stamped the final approval, the LLC was the undisputed legal owner of 4131 Willow Bend Lane. I called Tom, a local property manager I had hired through Marissa. Tom, I said over the phone. The deed is recorded. It is time. Deliver the notice. Tom drove to the house that same afternoon. According to his report, my mother opened the door. Tom did not introduce himself, did not offer sympathy, and did not answer her frantic questions. He simply handed her a formal, legally binding notice to vacate. It stated that the property was now under new ownership, the previous mortgage was dissolved, and all current occupants had exactly 72 hours to remove their belongings and vacate the premises, or law enforcement would be called to execute a forced eviction. I knew the panic inside that house must have been absolute chaos. I had planned to fly back to Portland the next morning without ever seeing their faces. I had my revenge on paper. I didn't need the dramatic confrontation, but the universe has a funny way of bringing things full circle. The next afternoon, I was walking out of a coffee shop in the downtown square, holding a flat white, heading toward my rental car. I zipped up my coat against the chill. As I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing directly across the street, outside the heavy glass doors of the local credit union, was my family. All 3 of them. They looked like refugees from a sunken ship. Julian was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, frantically yelling into his cell phone, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and cheap in the harsh daylight. Robert was leaning heavily against a brick wall, rubbing his temples, looking 10 years older than the last time I saw him. And Margaret, my mother, was clutching her purse to her chest, her face pale, her eyes wide with absolute, terrifying desperation. They had clearly just been denied a personal loan to rent a new place. They were completely out of options. I stood across the street, blending into the crowd of pedestrians. I watched them unravel, the golden boy and his enablers, finally facing the reality they had built. Suddenly, Margaret stopped looking at Julian. Her gaze drifted across the busy street. For a second, her eyes swept past me. Then they snapped back. She recognized the posture. She recognized the face. She froze completely. Her jaw actually dropped. She took a half step forward, her knuckles turning white around her purse strap. I could see the gears violently turning in her head. She saw me standing there in a tailored wool coat, looking healthy, calm, and entirely in control. She remembered the rumors she spread about me being a homeless drug addict. She remembered the notice to vacate signed by an anonymous LLC. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her knees visibly buckled. She knew. In that exact moment, looking across the asphalt, she knew the son she called a burden was the man who had just bought her house and kicked her onto the street. I did not cross the street. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I held her panicked gaze for 3 long seconds. Then I gave her a very slow, very deliberate nod. I turned on my heel and walked toward my rental car. I never looked back. My phone exploded that night. I was sitting at my terminal in the airport, waiting for my flight back to Portland, when the text messages started flooding in. They were all from Margaret. The tone had shifted from desperate manipulation to absolute, groveling panic. Wyatt, was that you today? Please tell me you didn't buy the house. Please tell me you aren't kicking us out. We have nowhere to go. Julian has no money. Dad is sick. Why are you doing this to us? We are still your family. I watched the text bubbles pop up on my screen, one after another. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation. I felt a clean, sterile peace. I let the messages sit there for a full hour before I finally typed my response. You were my family, and then you taught me exactly how little that meant. You taught me that money is more important than loyalty. You taught me that survival means cutting out the dead weight. I am just following your lessons. Be out by Friday, or Tom will call the sheriff. I blocked her number. I blocked Robert's number. I turned off my phone, boarded my flight, and went to sleep somewhere over the Midwest. Friday came and went. Tom sent me a text on Saturday morning with a series of photos. The house was empty. They had packed whatever they could fit into a rented U-Haul and vanished. The floors were scuffed, the walls were bare, and the shrine to Julian in the living room was gone. 2 weeks later, I flew back one last time to inspect the property before the renovation crews arrived. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence in the house was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It felt like the air after a violent thunderstorm, clean and completely still. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the cheap cinnamon candles my mother used to burn. I walked upstairs to my old bedroom. It was exactly as I had left it, plain and empty. I opened the closet door to make sure they hadn't left any trash behind. Sitting on the top shelf, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a small cardboard shoebox with my name written on it in faded black marker. I pulled it down and opened the lid. Inside were pieces of a boy who tried so hard to be loved. A handful of old report cards with straight A's that no one ever celebrated. A few childhood drawings. And at the bottom, a wrinkled, slightly torn thank you note I had written to my mother when I was 8 years old, thanking her for making me soup when I had the flu. She had kept it, or, more likely, she had just tossed it in a box and forgotten it existed for 20 years. I stared at the note for a long time. I realized then that the boy who wrote that note, the boy who craved their approval and bled his own accounts dry to keep them happy, didn't live here anymore. He had died on the kitchen floor of my apartment months ago. I put the note back in the box. Julian's criminal case finally concluded. Because of the mountain of evidence Marissa and I handed to the police, the forged signatures, the bank recordings, the digital IP trails, he had absolutely no defense. To avoid federal prison time, he was forced to take a brutal plea deal. He avoided a jumpsuit, but he was sentenced to 3 years of strict probation, hundreds of hours of community service, and massive financial restitution to the clients he embezzled from. But the real punishment was the permanent felony mark on his public record. Julian's entire identity was wrapped up in being a high-powered corporate consultant. With a felony fraud conviction, no reputable financial firm in the country would ever look at his resume again. The man who used to drive a Porsche and wear Italian suits was now working a night shift managing inventory at a big-box retail store, taking the bus because his license was suspended for unpaid fines. His empire of dirt had washed away entirely. As for my parents, they didn't fare much better. With no house, no credit, and Julian entirely broke, they had no choice but to beg extended family for help. They ended up moving 2 states away, cramming into a tiny, damp spare bedroom in Aunt Clara's house. According to the grapevine, Clara treated them exactly how they used to treat me, like a massive, ungrateful burden. She constantly held the living arrangement over their heads, making Margaret do all the cooking and cleaning to earn her keep. The woman who used to brag about her perfect family at country club dinners was now scrubbing her sister's baseboards just to have a place to sleep. A month after their move, a thick, handwritten envelope arrived at my apartment in Portland. The return address was Clara's house. I recognized my mother's slanted handwriting immediately. It was thick, probably pages and pages of apologies, excuses, and desperate pleas for reconciliation now that they were living in a nightmare of their own making. I walked over to my home office desk. I turned on my heavy-duty paper shredder. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't read a single word. I fed the thick letter directly into the metal teeth, listening to the satisfying hum of the machine tearing their excuses into tiny, illegible strips of confetti. Forgiveness is not a right. It is earned. And they had spent 30 years proving they didn't even want to try. While their lives shrank into a dark, bitter corner, mine expanded in ways I never thought possible. The Portland job was everything I wanted it to be. Within my first year as senior lead of operations, my restructuring plan had saved the company $1.5 million. I was respected, I was heard, and my salary grew to reflect my actual worth. My side business automating logistics for small delivery companies exploded, pulling in massive contracts that secured my financial freedom permanently. But there was still the issue of the house back in my hometown. The renovations were finally complete. It looked beautiful, new siding, fresh paint, modern appliances. Tom called me asking if I wanted him to list it on the rental market or put it up for sale. Selling it felt too easy. Renting it out for passive income felt petty, like I was just holding on to a trophy of my revenge. I wanted that piece of land to mean something entirely different. I wanted to cleanse it of the toxic, manipulative history it held. So, I had Marissa draft a new set of legal documents. I partnered with a highly respected local nonprofit organization in my hometown. I transferred the deed of the house into a newly established trust, naming it after my grandfather, the only person in my family who ever actually showed me unconditional kindness. We turned 4131 Willow Bend Lane into a transitional housing facility for young adults who were aging out of the state foster care system. We gave them a safe, fully funded place to live for 2 years while they attended college or learned a trade, completely rent-free. The house that had once been used as a weapon to control me, the house that represented my mother's vanity and my brother's greed, was now a sanctuary. It was providing the exact kind of safety and support to strangers that my own parents refused to provide for me. I funded the property taxes and maintenance completely out of pocket from my side business. It was the best money I ever spent. I took their darkest legacy and turned it into actual light. About a year after the house opened its doors to the first group of foster kids, I had to fly back to my hometown for a quick business conference. On my last night in town, I rented a car and drove out to Willow Bend Lane. It was late, just past 9 o'clock. I parked across the street, killed the engine, and rolled down the window. The neighborhood was quiet, exactly as it had been on the night I watched my mother realize I had bought the house. But the house itself was completely different. The porch light was glowing a warm, welcoming amber. Through the front living room window, I could see 3 young guys sitting around the coffee table, eating pizza, studying from open textbooks, and laughing. I leaned my head back against the driver's seat and just listened to the faint sound of their laughter drifting through the cool night air. I felt an overwhelming sense of completion. People will always tell you that blood is thicker than water. They will tell you that family is everything, that you have to forgive, that you have to endure the abuse because that is just how they are. But sitting there in the dark, I knew the absolute truth. Family is not blood. Blood is just an accident of biology. True family is built on respect, on mutual care, on the fundamental belief that you do not use the people who love you as stepping stones to save yourself. My parents and my brother chose to build their lives on a foundation of lies and exploitation. When that foundation collapsed, they expected me to throw myself into the rubble to cushion their fall. Instead, I stepped back, let it crash, and used the bricks to build my own empire. The house across the street no longer carried the Miller family legacy of shame and manipulation. Carried my legacy, and nobody could ever take that away from me. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a heavy one, but I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you have ever felt invisible in your own life. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Giving everything to people who give you nothing in return? If you have, I want you to know you are not alone, and walking away is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. If you made it all the way to the end, you are officially part of what I call the 1% Club. Drop a W in the comments below. W for winner. It is our secret sign to recognize the amazing people who watch until the very last second and refuse to let anyone hold them down. Please hit that like button, click subscribe, and follow along so we can share more stories together. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.